So I've decided my next vlog, and today I was listening to The Portal, Eric Weinstein. The talk was about her experiencing and realizing her grandpa was an SS Nazi member, and just the story around that. And Eric Weinstein is Jewish, and so what they discussed along with the details was just like wrapping your entire humanity around that, and just the fact that he was actually hosting her at his house and then followed with the interview. So that brought up a lot for me, and I was on a run just listening to that and just kind of like pondering. A lot of pondering was happening lately, more and more, especially when you have more time. So I'm going to share my personal experience around the story of my grandpa, who survived the Holocaust, and I was really close to my grandpa, and that was on one hand a bit of a fluke. So I was close anyway, in proximity, and we had the opportunity to be really involved with the farming, and my grandparents were on a farm, a really active vegetable farm, and just all of the chaos around that, and lots of, for myself, great memories, and sometimes not such great memories for my dad and the other siblings at times. But anyway, when my daughter, who is now 17 years old, I think she's around 4, my aunt asked if I would kind of take care of her daughter, who was about 2.5, 3, I think, and my grandparents, just kind of keep an eye. So it was all of us for a while, and it took me a little bit to decide yes, but there was something really deep inside that knew that this was really, really important for me to answer some questions. Some of those questions were verbalized, some of them weren't. So maybe you can relate. Sometimes there's just like this mishmash of feelings and knowings, and not necessarily have been articulated. So I'd like to share the story of my grandpa. I'd also like to share direct personal experiences, my grandma and grandpa, and the stories that I was privileged to be a part of, because when you sit with people for so long and take them like places like the coffee shop and other places that they wanted to, just spoil the little ones, you glean a lot, and hindsight is 2020. The value of those conversations are layered. They're like so deep. So what I'd like to tie it around into is the fact that we search for meaning, we search for answers and understanding, often based on something we might not have pegged with a word, or a restlessness, or just something that doesn't quite feel right, or we might notice a certain behavior or a trend in a family, or just things like that. So that's kind of what brought me to a bit of a quest, and I didn't even realize it was a quest. And I felt like there were lots of gaps, and not just like the detailed stories, like the events of the Holocaust, but it in translation. So I wanted a translation that sat right with me. So I was privileged to sort of soak that firsthand record of the experiences, and I'm gonna try my best to take you along a bit of a journey and kind of tie it all together to a little bit of like the neuroscience that I'm learning, big ING, and some of the impulses and just like the things that we carry in our genes that are related literally to the experiences of our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors. And there's something really beautiful in that, but there's also something that it calls out to be resolved. So I want to tie that all in, and especially to trauma. So yeah, just a little bit of a prep here to share that. So.
Doctor, and the truck that he was in was ambushed, and he fell out into a ditch on his back. Everyone else was killed except for him because they didn't see him, and it was just a horrific sight. And then at the end we reoriented and looked around the room, and I asked him about the pain level, and he said 1 or 2. Oh, I barely feel it. So that was working with that particular symptom.
Often live on in the physical patterns and the cognitive patterns that a client might develop after a traumatic experience. This can become a painful paradox because the very response that kept our client from harm can now also be keeping them from healing.
A picture of my grandparents. My grandpa was a tall, big, brilliant looking man. He had like the bluest of the bluest eyes you could ever imagine. And had grown some thick, luscious white hair. So anyway, he had a big brain, great big vocabulary, and was a complex but very resilient man, like unsinkable. So anyway, he did a lot of the talking, but there was one day that I really remember my grandma Martha, so I'm blessed to have inherited her name. She told me the story of how they met, and she also mentioned that when I turned 14, that when she was 14, she was taken to work. So, and she never, I don't think, returned to her village. So at 14, so first of all, like, just imagine that. So she was gonna work on a farm, and kind of moved there for good. So anyway, my grandpa and her eventually met, and every weekend the farmers would allow, you know, like a little party, and they were having a glass of wine, and she and my grandpa just clicked, connected, and she kissed him on the cheek, and then he, of course, interjected that he couldn't stop thinking about her, and just kind of like your typical young love story. So they ended up getting married, and you know, politically things were really brewing, and it ended up that the story kind of follows a couple of threads, but from my grandpa, he had mentioned there was somebody in the village that was like really passionate about Hitler, and would kind of become argumentative and would ask my grandpa why he wasn't joining the army and the regime. And my grandpa would reply, you know, like, I have brothers in other armies, and why would I? I don't think that he realized the severity that was like increasing. So long story short, he was picked up by police and taken into custody, and he was beat up, and then eventually like was on a train and ended up suddenly in the work camp. So the one that he stayed in for almost a year, I think it was Buchenwald, and he just said that he didn't realize what was happening, and he even just like was asking people that were there once things were dawning, how do I get out of here? And they pointed to the chimneys, and he still wasn't quite getting it. So after a while, he was getting it and starving, and realizing, oh my. So anyway, that was his point. My grandma, on the other hand, found out she was pregnant, and she had my aunt, and she was trying to work in the field and take care of my aunt, and my aunt would have to stay in a crib for a really long time, so she would work a bit and then come back and try and take care of the baby. And then eventually I guess the Nazi, I don't know what you would call like nurses, or maybe it's like a social service, they took my aunt to a place, kind of like an orphanage, and away from my grandma. And then my grandma got really, really sick. So these are separate stories. Of course, she doesn't know where my grandpa is, because he just disappeared suddenly, and she's probably collecting like hearsay from all kinds of people, from what they've heard, the little bits and pieces. So anyway, she ends up in a hospital, and she's like super duper sick. And then she mentioned that she had her tonsils taken out, and without anesthetic, and there's a long story around that. So a beautiful story, and just in the meantime, my grandpa is starving in a work camp. So my grandpa would talk about the work camp, and we're really lucky that he would share his experience instead of, like it's common for trauma and Holocaust survivors to not share. So we are lucky that he did. And he would mention a couple of things he mentioned to me personally and to other family members and friends. He said that he had outside of his window the pile, the famous pictures that we see of bodies that were in heaps. And he would mention that he could see breath coming out in the cold days that some of them were living. And then he mentioned this to me, which struck me on our many drives with the kids in the back seat arguing. And he once said to me, Marta, he said, I would often think about the officers and how sometimes I thought they have it worse. And he said that they have to go home and try to live a normal life after they see what's going on. And he spun it around in a way that he said, that it was from a place of compassion and just that he couldn't imagine how they could live with the images that they would see every day. So that was really interesting. So the liberation, the best part of the story. My grandpa would say they would hear the battle going on, and so like shots fired and different things going on in the background, maybe like in forest areas or places beside the camp. And he said there was one particular day that they heard it closer than normal, and they would listen. And this is really significant to me because we had just in my car picked up my son, who was maybe in like grade 4 or 5, maybe a little older. Yeah, maybe grade 5 or 6. And I just was struck that my grandpa was telling my son first-hand account of his liberation. I just remember it was like one of those moments in time that just like stopped. And he said, and he even did like the machine gun sound. He goes, we could hear like I'm doing a terrible example, and he said it got louder, and he's telling the entire story to my son. And anyway, that's just something I'll never forget. And then he said it got closer and closer, and they're straining to see who represents the tanks, and then they realized it was the Americans. And he said the entire camp jumped and sang and spun, and they rejoiced. And then he watched the tanks come closer and closer until the tanks like rolled right over the barbed wire and came right into the camp. And he said there was so much rejoicing and joy, and he was crying when he said this, and he said with tears that he always thinks of the Americans connected to that. So I think that's just beautiful. I know America, there's lots of opinions around, but that's a really good memory for my grandpa. So anyway, he then added to the story that the Americans were like throwing food because they were coming across these camps and shocked at what was going on. And he was telling his campmates to go easy on the eating, because he had an uncle that had said to him, if you ever starve and it's been a long time, just nibble food, don't eat. And it's sure enough, some of the campmates unfortunately would eat so much that they actually died of eating too much too quickly. So my grandpa was liberated technically, but long ways away from just like the life that we would picture of ease. So he said that he tried to start to walk back to his village to find my grandma, but it was just too weak, so he'd have to walk back to the camp. And he waited a while longer until his strength returned, and then he started to walk, finally found his way back to the village, finally found his way, and he said that he was asking where, you know, his wife was, and he even said that people would say, oh, it's a new day, why don't you just start fresh? I think it's just astonishing. Like, most people assumed that their significant others were dead. Anyway, he found my grandma eventually, and she was in a hospital, and I'm not even sure what exactly happened in the hospital, but he also found my aunt, and this is the story around that. It's a really sweet story. He said that he found the place where, like, the babies and the children that were taken were, and he recognized who Oksana, Sandra, was, and the way that he described it was she was so cute, but she was terrified of him. So he lured her with chocolate, and that worked. So he took my Aunt Sandra, my grandma, and then they eventually ended up in a refugee camp waiting, hoping to be sponsored to come to Canada. So they, I think it was around 2 years, I could be wrong with the times and dates exactly, but that's where my dad was born. So he was born during that time, and I could be a bit off on the dates because I think my family mentioned that my dad was like just before, like, pre-kindergarten when they arrived in Canada, or in kindergarten. So that's got to be about 3 years or so in a refugee camp, something along those lines. So the little family immigrates right to Brantford. There was a beautiful family to this day, the last name Sabrowski, that sponsored my grandparents and my dad and my Aunt Sandra, and then eventually they made their way to Boston, little Boston, here near Waterford, just a little town, a tiny little town, and began to farm. So that's how they ended up here.
Look in my face if you're awake.
There's also a funny story that I'd like to mention. My grandma, I don't know, a couple of my aunts were in a large grocery store doing their shopping. So this is here many years later. And my grandma, who never learned to drive, so she was always kind of dripping around, and would, put her babushka on sometimes, and she always had these really beautiful hats, and I remember
It could have been your life.
Anyway, they were in the grocery store, and I think they were, putting items on for checkout, and she looked down and she pointed to, the magazines that are at the beginning of the checkout. Oh, look, there's Tato. So Tato is dad in Ukrainian. And sure enough, on the front of Time magazine was the famous picture. So this is August 1996 Life edition. So I guess it was on the front cover of Time. And so this is the famous picture of Behind the Bars, the Faces of War, the title here. And my grandpa remembers this picture being taken, and they're hanging on to the barbed wire. And I'll point you to my grandpa. This is him at the back, right here where I'm pointing. And it's amazing because my grandma just instantly recognized, and he has just like the details, the genetics that are carried right through the family of these eyes, and it's funny, you can see it. And yeah, it's just crazy, the features, those eyes. So anyway, that's my grandpa, and he spoke of them approaching the fence because there was a female photographer that had got permission to photograph them. So this is 1996 edition, and it's a story about that. So
like the right thing to do.
my grandparents were obsessed with kids and food, warmth, nurturing, and it was absolutely unbelievable because it hadn't been like culturally refined, and it was so closely linked to starvation and lack, and just I think that their relationship with life was just so raw. The beauty of their experience in translation, the beautiful side was this unspeakable, unconditional love, this appreciation for life's particular babies. There was this like, literally, you couldn't eat enough, you couldn't be warm enough. Oh, it was stifling at times. They were like, went to the other end of the pendulum, sometimes with excess, but it was impulse to like survive and protect. So I remember noticing that, but there was so much comfort there too. I knew I was always accepted. I was never judged, and all that kind of stuff. When it came to relationships, I know my grandpa in particular was a very kind of like I mentioned earlier, like just unsinkable, the biggest brain. He was like really stubborn, very funny, very quick, but his emotional pendulum would swing definitely. So as he got older, what I experienced is he would make a joke that was truly funny, and then really close in time be like sobbing. So, and when he sobbed, he would also pray, and he would also sing. So sounds a little crazy, but it was really interesting, and he was always just like spilling out. And I remember thinking that was probably his saving grace compared to like stuffing it down. No filter at all whatsoever. Just like spilled and spilled. So when he was in a good mood, it was awesome. When he wasn't in a good mood, he could be pretty contentious, and but that was the unsinkable side. So there were times he was very, very contentious with me, but because I was a granddaughter, I think I had a bit of a buffering. So anyway, I know that was like directly linked to unresolved trauma. And there's a book that I read not that long ago called The Body Keeps Score, and it just like talks about when there's trauma that's unresolved. It's a picture like a hot wire, that is always surging through the system, and it's eroding the system until that hot wire is resolved. And so a trauma that's unresolved, a person's entire life can be shaped around that and crippled by that until it is resolved and processed. Many sicknesses are just like the nervous system is constantly like gas metal to the pedal, like in a car, and it's just automatic until the nervous system is sort of reset. When it isn't resolved, it can be passed through DNA, and there's a lot of interesting study around that. So that was part of like the personal reason why I wanted to look at it from a subjective but also some objectivity. So I'm hoping that you enjoyed my thinking out loud, my reminiscing, and just I wanted to share some of the personal connections that I've drawn from this story, the connections that run through my blood, my DNA. Healing trauma, whether we recognize an event as being worthy of trauma or not, that's not even the point. It's something that is out of our control. So it could be a really obvious traumatic event. It could be something that we may dismiss. If it has set our neurochemistry kind of like that hot wire and it's not resolved, it's trauma. One of the ways that I've learned to just like really tangibly measure trauma is if a memory comes up and the emotion is still really strong attached to that memory, it's likely that there is some unresolved stuff going on. When we have a memory and subconsciously or consciously it continues to create a response, the body is thinking that it's still ongoing, so it's still prepared to respond in that fight flight, so the body doesn't feel safe.
But you'll have to stay right here, I'm afraid, until we get a better idea of your state. It could have been your life.
Personally, to just like fire up really quickly. So I have a hot wire, hot temper. And when I say that to people, some people smile and just like can't imagine it, but you can talk to my family and realize that's very true. So whatever the symptom is, it could be anger, it could be depression, it could be rage, it could be a lack of intimacy, the inability to verbalize emotions. It could be the inability to take a feeling and share it with somebody. So these are relational things. A reaction happening inside of me that's responding something that doesn't match it, if that makes sense. So if you took my blood chemistry on a moody day and where like things are just not going that way, my reaction is mounting a response that just doesn't match the sort of insignificance of what is actually going on. So that's a sign that there's this inner circuitry that's revved. So instead of, which I would automatically go, why do I freak out about, instead just take a step back and say, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper. So are these neurological responses in behavior to my environment relationship, had they been wired early on? Likely. So the way that we respond to our world and people around us is literally wired as we grow up, when we're young and when we're mapping out those connections. I've also heard it said that the nervous system is the boss. It's the boss of how we feel, and tying it back into yoga, that's why it is so essential to tap into the calm response and train and retrain ourselves to access the calm response in ways that are sustainable. So it's common that people that have that type of response I was just saying, that kind of doesn't match something, there's layers of emotions that are added to that, where like there's like judgment and regret, and then there's examples of violence and abuse, and then the people that are perpetuating that abuse are caught in these vicious cycles of guilt and then regret, and it's just so miserable. And many of those circuits started when they were developing. And so the environment that they developed their nervous system and coping skills in was unsafe. That's inherited, and there's a lot around the study of literally babies that are born in midst of trauma, and how the mapping genetically follows into the offspring. So there's work to be done. And so often we look at health through, like diet, and we look at health through just sort of those types of things, when we need to go deeper. And and I'm just gonna be super honest, part of the reason that I kind of dismissed this type of work was because I thought you just gotta get over it. And
for me to see.
And what happens when we do that is it means that we're not recognizing something that we have no control over.
Belong to me, and I saw you.
And we're actually burying ourselves deeper under that by deciding what should and shouldn't matter.
Feel like the right thing to do, but I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Knowing you probably hate me if I told you the truth.
There's a really interesting study around how yoga treats trauma. So I just wanted to quickly touch on the fact that we don't necessarily have to keep on revisiting the actual trauma, because it's not fixed here. It's fixed in the body, and that's referring to how the body keeps score. And so when we practice yoga and we learn to tap into our calm response, our rest and digest parasympathetic branch of our nervous system, and we begin to train that, it's really neat, because through meditation and mindfulness and actually doing something totally different than chipping away constantly at the event that's stuck in our head, we deal with the body response to that event. And it's amazing how that will heal and rewire that response to trauma that is eroding a person's life. and to, without judgment, look at behavior as a symptom. So if there's a pattern of, relationship troubles, or there's a pattern of addiction, or there's a pattern of depression, or there's a pattern. So looking at behavior as a symptom and then digging a little bit deeper. And there's so much out there. So I'm going to leave you with, there's my bookshelf there. So many resources that are helping me. So I am just at the just the tip of the iceberg understanding this. And I am committed to learning to be well, not just for myself, but for my children and someday my grandchildren. And in this world of violence and hate, it is essential that we do this work, because it is an exponential effect energetically, directly, and this world we need to heal.
Cause you're gonna be okay. Just some bruises and scrapes, but you'll have to stay right here, I'm afraid, until we get a better idea of your state. It could have been